Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, whenever and wherever you are listening. This is an episode of the Two Lost Souls podcast. My name is Ravi Amrath, and I am joined, as usual, in the therapy room by the sensational Michelle Sudbury. How are you doing, Michelle?
Hello, Ravi. I'm really good, thank you. How are you today?
Yes, not bad. Quite tired, actually. It feels like there's a lot going on in talking therapy land at the moment. I say a lot going on, but it's just the usual seeing lots and lots of clients day in and day out, really. How are things for you?
Talking therapies. Yeah, very similar. It's very busy. I'm obviously not seeing lots and lots of clients, but very busy in lots of other ways. And I'm also very tired, which is really worrying because it's Monday. So that hasn't set us up very well for the rest of the week, really, has it?
No, it hasn't. This is our sign to perhaps somehow figure out a way of taking a buttload of annual leave.
2 weeks in August.
Wow. Oh. Just a month to go.
Just a month. I'm not counting or anything. No. But yeah, just about a month. Yeah. How about you? Got anything planned?
Not that I know of, actually. So maybe I need to think about what my plans are in terms of actually taking a bit of a break. Some housekeeping before we continue with today's episodes. We have launched the Two Lost Souls mailing list. Obviously, when we set up this podcast, we decided to use the social media platform formerly known as Twitter. And Twitter's changed a lot. Don't know if anyone has noticed out there, but it's not the same as it used to be. And every time you log on, you're like, definitely not in Kansas anymore, Toto. In order to build a bit more of a community and find more like-minded souls, I guess, we have launched the Two Lost Souls mailing list, and we would love it if you could sign up at twolostsouls.co.uk. All the information about the podcast is there. You've got useful links that we have gathered, curated and collated over the course of the show so far, designed to help people not only on their training journey, but beyond, and also links to all the episodes that we have recorded so far. Why should I join the mailing list? I hear you ask. Well, firstly, you'll find out about episodes before anyone else does. You'll also have the opportunity to contribute to upcoming episodes and ask questions of some fantastic guests that we have coming up for you as well. We are due to be doing some episodes on long-term health conditions, on burnout, and on children and young people's IAPT as well. And all of these areas have had some really significant demand while we have been doing this podcast. So if you would like to get any questions in, sign up to the mailing list and just hit the reply button whenever we send you an email. Or alternatively, you can email us at hello@twolostsouls.co.uk and we will be able to get your queries there. In today's episode, we will be talking about atypical career paths in CBT for a variety of reasons. First of all, I recently joined the UK CBT Psychotherapists and Trainees group on Facebook. Shout out to them. And there has been a lot of worry on that group, particularly given the state of NHS changes, restructures, improvements, depending on which lens you're going to look this through. People are worried about their roles, whether it's worth doing the high intensity training, whether they'll find themselves a role afterwards. In some trusts, it appears as though there is the looming threat of redundancy. So we thought it was important to take a look at other paths that can be followed with the knowledge that you have gained during your CBT training. Regardless, even if redundancy is not looming for you, even if you're not quite at the point where you want to leave the NHS talking therapies landscape, it's worth noting that for many people, working 5 days a week full-time in a talking therapy service just doesn't work out. I've seen some data from some freedom of information requests from talking therapy services located in the West Midlands. And from what I've seen, in many services, over 50% of the people working at Band 7 are working on a part-time basis. And the frustrating and somewhat upsetting reality of the world we live in nowadays is that we still have to make ends meet. And so there may be other career avenues that you want to explore alongside the day-to-day role of working as a therapist. So that's partly the reason why we wanted to explore this with you. Is there anything else that you think will be important for us to explore as part of this, Shell?
I just think it's exciting, really, to have a guest today that is going to be able to share with us a life outside of the NHS that has been diversified in order to match the changing landscape of talking therapies, particularly since things like COVID, where hybrid working has enabled people to work in very different ways anyway. And flexible working changes as well, meaning that it's far easier now to condense hours and give yourself a little bit of time to do something that isn't just the 9 to 5 talking therapy slog that it can become on occasion. Doesn't mean you don't love your job, but it can still be very draining and exhausting and fatiguing in its own way. So, yeah.
100%. In terms of the way that this episode works, it does meander somewhat, slightly different to a usual Two Lost Souls episode where we usually have a set topic in mind and we go straight into that topic. This takes a bit more of a wandering deep dive into Sven's career and the learnings from it that you can use in terms of influencing your journey in the future. And so without further ado, let's welcome into the therapy room Sven Law. Sven, first of all, thank you very much for coming on. How are you doing today?
Great, yeah. Thanks for having me, Ravi and Michelle. I appreciate being here.
No worries at all. I have had the pleasure of knowing you for, I think, around a year now. I think if my memory serves correctly, I am lucky to know about the meandering path that your career has taken in terms of health and social care. Talk us through that journey that you've been on. Talk us through your background in CBT.
Yeah, sure. So you use the word meandering there, and I guess that kind of reflects that it all started a long time ago before I really knew what I wanted to do at university, and I was meandering back then about what do I do, and at that point I'd been a carer for a number of years, so I kind of started out my career in health and social care being a carer, darting around the East Riding of Yorkshire as a young carer on a little moped going to support older people getting up and starting their day, getting washed and dressed and that kind of thing. And originally at university, I wanted to study to be an occupational therapist. And then I fell into being a social worker. So I actually ended up studying social work. And that was a really diverse course at Lancaster University. Really a great experience, 2 great placements, one that took me into working with people with learning disabilities and another that took me into a community mental health team working with people with a range of severe and enduring mental health problems. I guess since that time, I've taken a particular interest in mental health. I spent about 10 years as a social worker, mostly working in mental health and community mental health teams, specialising for some time in older adult mental health, working in a older adult mental health team in Lancashire. And that's when I started to work under the supervision of a psychologist who basically was brought in to say, we think the whole team could benefit from working in a more psychologically minded way. And she introduced me to various different models like solution-focused therapy and cognitive behavior therapy, CBT. And I remember using it with my first older adult of over the age of 80, being pleasantly surprised at how this 80-plus-year-old lady who'd been suffering with panic for many years made staggering progress in a short space of time using cognitive behavior therapy, going from not being able to get out the house to being able to go and pick up her prescription at the local pharmacy down the road. And I guess that's where it all began, Ravi. But as you know, it unfolds in lots of different directions when I later trained to become a CBT therapist under the wonderful IAPT program, so the Improving Access to Psychological Therapies program, and the training opportunity that kindly provided to me as a social worker with mental health experience.
Wow. I mean, just based on what you said there, I mean, it's clear that this is a case of being bitten by the bug. You employing this tool that's newly arrived in your toolbox and it working incredibly well and wanting to find out more about it. From dipping your toe in the water and trying some of these skills under the supervision of a psychologist through to actually taking that full-on dive into the pool. How did you find that part of the journey? What would you say were your main reflections on that part of your career?
It was quite daunting, to be honest. It did also come at a time of my life where there'd been quite a lot of stresses in terms of moving, location. I think I recall the high-intensity training really living those two first words, high intensity. And it was intensive from a learning perspective, from, gaining all that knowledge in a short space of time, putting it into practice, and also learning about yourself and your own reactions to how you deal with stress yourself. And I just recall that the service I was working in was facing quite a few difficulties, shortage of staff. Unfortunately, the manager of that service at the time was unwell. There was a backlog of cases, of people waiting to be seen, and there was a lot of unassessed referrals, so lots of people with complexities that first of all needed an assessment, and it wasn't a great match. So, one of the first things that we had to deal with was that, a lot of the cases that we were being asked to see were not training suitable cases. So, it was a challenge, Ravi. I'll be honest with you. There were a few moments where I thought, I'm not sure I'm going to make it through this training, and sleepless nights and nightmares and waking up feeling like, am I the therapist here, or am I actually transitioning into becoming the patient with anxiety difficulties? So it was tough.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating to hear you say that, because having known you for this time now, you strike me as someone who is incredibly knowledgeable and incredibly passionate about CBT. And I'm wondering, what is it that helped you navigate through those challenges? What is it that kind of kept you interested in this despite the obstacles at the time?
I think good supervision through the university. It was a very well supervised course, and the course director himself was a very patient and skilled person. So Mark Latham, who was running the course then, I just remember, having a sense from him that his door was always open. He had a very calming effect on us. I suppose my partner was very supportive during that difficult time. And also, we were all in the same boat. So the peers that I was doing the training with, we were all going through the same thing. We were all anxious, and we were all, if I mention the dreaded word OSCE, the Observed Clinical Skills Exam, I think it stands for, if I recall correctly, where we had to do some role plays, etc. Yeah, so just remembering we're all in the same boat, and what we're trying to do is achieve something in a condensed space in time. The training would normally be done, I think, over at least 2 years, and here we are doing it in a year. So,
got you. At the risk of putting the horse before the cart somewhat, that Sven, who was anxious over the course of this period of study, over this really intense year, what do you think Sven from then would make of the Sven we find in front of us now, and the career of Sven as he stands now?
I think he'd be quite surprised, actually, that this is where it can take you, because I think back then I was thinking, I'll be lucky if I can be a confident therapist getting through an average week in an NHS service consistently over a prolonged period of time. I guess because the reality was that, seeing that many people in a week and using the evidence-based models, etc., that was tough going. So to think that I would get to where I am now, where I'm a supervisor and an accredited supervisor and an accredited trainer, and that I've worked in companies where they're building and developing technologies to help support the work that we do. I don't think I would have predicted that. So I think that that was born out of my passion for CBT, for evidence-based mental health practice. Going back then, I wouldn't have anticipated that career path.
In terms of exploring that journey a little bit more, most people find that the first route up in terms of progressing from being a therapist is to rise up the ranks of a talking therapy service, go into management, senior management. Walk us through, after you have qualified from the HICBT course, what does the pathway look from then for Sven?
Well, it pretty much was as you described, actually, Ravi, but it happened a little bit quicker than expected. So the organisation I was working in started the IAP service on a bit of a shoestring. So it was quite a small commission service where actually in the beginning for that service, I was the only qualified taken on board. The others were trainees. And we actually started with pretty much a 6-month waiting list because as soon as the GPs found out, that this service was starting, the floodgates opened, and I was the only qualified, and the others were doing their course. So obviously, there were limits to what we had capacity-wise. That service went through 2 restructures in quite a short space of time. So the organisation got TUPE'd. So for anyone that's listening that doesn't know what TUPE is, that's when the service transfers over to another organisation. So it can be from one NHS trust to another NHS trust, as it was in this case. So another NHS trust twice took over the service in a fairly short space of time. And they needed someone to basically step up and become the senior CBT therapist, and then I think they called it the area manager or something like that. I can't even remember my own job title from them, but it was a management role. Locality manager, I think that was what it was. Locality manager, that's right. And I was still very new, very energized, and very passionate about the IAPT project, about what we were trying to achieve in the UK with IAPT, which I still really do believe in. I come from a different background of a different culture, so I was born in Germany and I have family there. And the reality is I know that other countries just do not have these provisions in place, and the waiting lists are horrendous. If we think we've got it bad in the UK, they have it worse in other countries where you might think, because they're insurance based, that they would have things sorted. So very passionate about IAPT, and I was then, and I think that kind of resulted in me or people confiding in my ability to use that to take the service through a difficult time. And that's what I did. But as part of that, I decided I want to do some training in leadership, and I enrolled on the Mary Seacole program, the NHS Leadership Academy. Brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And it really did give me insights into what is actually leadership. What does it mean? And what is the difference between leadership and management, for example? And as part of that, there is a project that you have to do in your service, a service improvement project. And this led really to us having to think about how can digitization help the service with problems like lack of rooms, for example, long waiting lists, How can we use digital to assist us to streamline or make certain processes more lean? And that's where it all began, I guess, really, with the career starting to branch out.
Wow. I mean, that's amazing. I mean, to start with there, I suppose the words frying pan and fire spring to mind, actually, in terms of you've already just gone on this massively intensive year, fought your way through it. And here we are in another situation where you are the only qualified therapist with trainees working amongst you, a 6-month waiting list. And I'm curious, looking back at your career, what would you say were the skills that you had at the time that allowed you to be a good manager or a good leader, even at that early stage?
Important here is the difference between being a hero and using the team, essentially, to put it bluntly. So in the very early days, I even had it in my head that in order to be a good manager or a good leader, I had to solve all the problems myself. I had to come up with the solutions. I felt this tremendous pressure. I was directly reporting to directors, for example, had the budgetary responsibilities, etc. And I thought I had to solve the problems myself. And then I realized I was trying to be the hero. And there is this concept that you're introduced to on the C-call training, that we don't want to be the hero. They have this image of, the guy in front of the horse chariot cracking the whip. We don't want to be doing that, because then we're not really getting people to buy into what it is that we're trying to achieve as a collective. And so I think it was a shift in mindset. And what allowed me to do that was the fact that I've always been a really reflective practitioner. It really starts with the social work training, because in your social work training, or at least in mine, being a reflective practitioner was one of the core skills. So the ability to reflect on what you're doing, how you're doing it, the impact that you have on others around you, how your position can carry power, and how that power imbalance can affect vulnerable people when you're working with them. So I think being reflective and being able to step back and think about how I'm doing things, the impact that I'm having on those around me, obviously very useful in therapy too, I would have thought. That helped me to be prepared to evolve and to learn and continuously learn and be willing to make mistakes and get it wrong and to do it better next time.
You mentioned there this sense of not being the hero. I suppose there is quite a significant overlap there with therapy, actually, in terms of us being the cheerleader and not the guru, often trying to imbue skills in our clients to be the one to throw the rubber ring in rather than jumping in to save everyone else all the time. And I'm wondering, when we look at that part of your career, what would you say the pros and cons were of rising up the managerial ladder in IAPT?
First of all, Ravi, I have to say you are the master of metaphors. I think those were some very nice metaphors that you used there. You're absolutely right. I think
for full disclosure, I think I stole the cheerleader guru one from Dr. Richard Bennett. So he should take the credit for that.
I like the throwing the ring in one.
Thank you.
Absolutely right. Yeah. So pros and cons. I think the pros for me were that it opened up different opportunities, different skills. So I learned areas of working in the NHS system that I wouldn't have been introduced to otherwise, such as managing budgets, working with commissioners, dealing with structures to do with who owns properties, how can we get rooms, what are the contractual obligations, all that kind of stuff. So it really did start to open up some of the knowledge that I had, how are directors accountable, and how are budgets managed, and what happens when the NHS has underspend or overspend, those kind of things. I wouldn't have known those things. I would say that the downside for me at the time was that it moved me further and further away from the thing that I really wanted to be in this career for, which was providing therapy and helping people get better. And I remember sort of realizing that quite quickly, and just not having time to even carry a small caseload, and then also being asked to supervise therapists and feeling a bit like a fraud, thinking, well, how can I supervise therapists when I'm not even seeing clients myself? And I just wasn't satisfied with that. I just didn't think that was acceptable. But the job was so big with the organizational changes that the reality was there just wasn't time. So I found time outside of my day job to start seeing patients on a private basis, a small caseload, just to keep my skills going. And that's when I actually found my way to IESO Digital Health. So for those out there that don't know IESO, they're a Cambridge-based company that started with a clinical trial testing live messaging-based CBT for depression versus face-to-face to see, does it work just as well? And they found that it did for depression initially. So I started working as a therapist associate, so a private therapist, taking case by case on and delivering live messaging-based therapy, mostly on an evening, sometimes on a weekend. And I loved it. I just absolutely loved it. And I was really surprised at the results that I was getting. So I just adapted quite quickly to delivering CBT through live messaging. It just suited my way of thinking, had time to reflect, etc. And yeah, well, that was it then, wasn't it? I was in love with the application of technology and this crossover between technology and the therapy landscape. And that was my next job. I moved then over to them as a supervisor.
That's amazing. And Shell, I saw you nodding quite a lot when talking about the fact that managerial roles tend to pull us away from clinical work. What are your thoughts?
Yes, Sven, I think that really hit a nerve with me. Obviously, I'm more operational now than clinical. And in a similar fashion to yourself, I've had to move outside of my day job, the NHS, in order to stay kind of true to what I really got into the industry for in the first place, and that's supporting other people. And when you just kind of highlighted feeling like a bit of a fraud when you weren't doing your clinical work but you were delivering supervision, I completely relate. It's so important, isn't it, that we're up to date with our practice and that we're, supervising from our experience, not from a textbook. So I had to take a very similar path and also work for IESO, which I love. And that's where my clinical activity really comes from now, because the operational element of the role just doesn't allow for it. So, yeah, very, very similar pathways.
With that in mind, can I ask how rising up the managerial ranks changed you or impacted on you as a therapist? I'm just sort of thinking, people like the sausages, but they don't always like to see how they're made. So I'm just wondering how having that exposure to the back office stuff and all the behind the scenes stuff changed how you worked on the front line.
It did change. It did change me. I think I've always been good at taking a helicopter view in most things that I do. So I already had that kind of context perspective of what IAPT was actually trying to achieve. Quite ambitious, really, if we think about it. And a couple of sort of topics that came up were sort of fairness and equity, really. And I think one of the things that therapists in the service that I was in did struggle with at times was that idea that we're trying to deliver therapy under a certain amount of sessions in accordance with the protocols and the trials that have been conducted, etc. And I think that tension was visible in some more so than others. And that had to be addressed because we had to balance the needs of those waiting, which was considerable, against the needs of those that were currently in a therapy slot, who perhaps weren't necessarily seeing the benefits that we would expect from something like CBT or EMDR when it's working effectively. And I guess I saw the other side of that from a managerial's perspective, that from an organizational perspective, that is a really hard balance to get. And that interface between those delivering it at the cold face and those that are having to defend the effective use of resources. And I still think it's right that we have that ongoing debate, because I mentioned before, that I come from, I was born in a different country, and the context of healthcare in Germany is that it's very unregulated, and the therapy sessions can go on for long periods of time, and no one is really checking, and supervision is much less than we are used to in the IAP service. And the offside of that is that people can wait a very long time. We're talking like 2 years in some areas to even get started with therapy. So yeah, I suppose it exposed me to that resource management side of things and what that really means.
In terms of the next steps from there, then how long is it that you were working in those kind of senior management or management circles for?
It was only a couple of years, I think, in the context of the NHS. And I have to admit, the TUPE processes had taken their toll. It was quite difficult because, as you probably know, you gain a certain amount of momentum with the changes that you implement. It takes quite a lot of effort to get everybody mentally on board. And then here we are again, we're being told that we have to change everything again because a different organisation is going to be running it, and they have their own idea of how things should be done.
There will be some people out there who perhaps find it quite easy to hold a lot of compassion and space for clients who come into services, yet if they're tasked with rising up the chain, becoming management, compassion fatigue can sometimes set in. And so I'm curious what advice you have for those people in terms of actually continuing to hold that space just for the employees within the service that they will be supporting as they climb up the ladder.
I mean, compassionate leadership is a whole big topic, so I think just for me, it's always been sort of being able to zoom out. But there have been times when I've really struggled to zoom out, and you're very much sort of locked into that situation and seeing it from the parapet rather than, from the helicopter. So I think sometimes people just need a bit of space. And for me, I've always had at least one other leader, one other mentor that's helped me to kind of regain perspective. And it's just finding that person, finding that ally that can help you have a bit of realism, So when I think back to those days, there's always been somebody that is a bit long in the tooth, that's seen it all, been there, done that, got the T-shirt, and can say, "Look, Sven, don't worry, it'll probably go 360 in another year, and we'll be back to square one." So. Don't lose too much sleep over it. You're doing your best, that kind of thing. So I think good mentors are helpful. Targets
get vilified a lot by people, particularly in the nature of NHS talking therapy services, IAP services, in terms of how they can often remove nuance, I suppose, in terms of how they can often be really pressurizing, not only for people delivering therapy on the front line, but also people as they work their way up the managerial chain. And so I'm wondering what your thoughts are on targets, and I'm wondering how you manage that side of things as you worked your way up.
I guess it's just about being pragmatic. We need those targets in order to focus on where we're heading. It reminds me of having goals in therapy. What is it that we're trying to work towards together? it's the thing that can bind us, but it can also be the thing that divides. And I suppose it's about that sense of sharing those targets. And that kind of brings me back to that compassionate leadership, is that idea of being able to bring people in on that collective goal that you're working on, or goals that you're working on, to give people a sense of ownership of those and to let people take responsibility. So I just remember transitioning from that idea of being, the hero leader that needs to be making all the decisions and making all the changes, to actually realizing, well, actually, if I allow my team to take some responsibility and them to take some ownership of some of these things, they're more involved, they're more invested, and it's more shared. The offside of that was when people feel under pressure, they obviously worry about being able to meet their targets. I think those of you out there who have had the pleasure of working with me as a team leader or manager can answer this for yourselves, but I always feel that I've always been very fair and sat down with the individual and worked out what is their version of manageable. And very rarely have I come across individuals that have been really unreasonable. I have come across on occasion where someone is making decisions based on their best interests rather than the patient's best interests. And that's something that just doesn't sit with me. I always think, if it was your relative who was accessing the service, would you be happy with that? And if I have people in my team that are saying that they're basing their decision on what they're doing based on what's better for their journey to work, for example, because we once had the dilemma of one waiting list literally 15 minutes down the road being half of the waiting list in the city where we were, and having to ask therapists to move their daily working routine to increase capacity in one area over the other, and being told that didn't fit with what was better for the commute to work. I think it's, wherever possible, do it together, make decisions together, share the goals. The targets are there, they're not going to go away. And I think they're a good thing. If I again think about other healthcare systems where there is a lack of targets, the costs are spiraling out of control, and soon enough, they will be having to think about what they can do differently. I think the thing with IAPT is it was kind of preemptive. Some would argue maybe not soon enough, but if we think about the fact that it came from an economist as well as psychologist, the idea was to use the resources more effectively to the greater good and the well-being of the nation.
You end up rising up the ladder. These 2 Ps are grating on you. You end up being pulled away from clinical work and kind of needing to make up for that in your own time to keep skin in the game, as it were. I'm wondering, in terms of the onward journey, you've mentioned IESO. Walk me through the other technology companies that might feature in this next part of the pathway, and talk us through the roles and the variety of work that has followed for you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the next journey that I made after working as a clinical team lead and supervisor at IESO was then I saw an opportunity to be clinical lead for a company that does not exist in the UK anymore. And so it was called CBT Limited. They took on, many of you may remember, Fear Fighter. It was one of the very early computerized CBT programs for panic disorder that found its way into the NICE guidelines because it had very good evidence and was put through RCTs. So they took that software on, and they had a suite of other programs for problems like OCD. They were essentially an alternative computerized provider to the very well-known SilverCloud. And yeah, they took me on as a clinical lead. I then later became the CEO of the UK organisation. So it was actually bought out by US-based investors. And the reason it doesn't exist in the UK anymore is because we identified it would probably need considerable investment in order to bring the software and the technology up to speed with the competitors. The clinical background of the programs, I can say, was very sound. But as you know, that's not enough. If you want to engage people in technology, it needs to be usable. It needs to look right, feel right. I dare say even needs to be a bit attractive to get traction. Because one of the problems with technology is getting good engagement. It's well documented that things like computerized CBT, as effective as they are, they're only effective when people actually engage in them consistently.
Yeah, and I suppose for any fellow nerds of mine out there, I suppose we're talking UX design, right?
Yeah. So usability and design, they have a crossover. And you've got to get the balance of both right. I think they were very usable programs, but design-wise, they were a little bit outdated. The investment that's required in order to bring things up to speed is considerable. And it's a sort of chicken and egg situation. So when you don't hold a considerable proportion of the contracts in the UK within the NHS, are you willing and prepared to put in investment into that technology before you have that commitment from your potential customers? And I guess ultimately, the investors based in New York decided not to do that, and they sold the program to Magellan Healthcare, which is a US insurance provider, who have now got those programs and have revamped them a little bit. So they've done that work to spruce them up. And so they now offer all their insured people the possibility to do computerized CBT through their insurance scheme. And it no longer exists in the UK, which is a great shame. But it was a really good opportunity for me to learn more about technology, its application, what are the barriers to getting it adopted in the NHS, what are the compliance requirements, because there's quite strict compliance requirements in terms of adoption of technology and the data security that's required with that, etc. And the NHS requires that technology that is used within it has to be clinically safe. So there is a whole set of requirements called the DCB requirements that are centered around that. And I learned all about that. And I had the pleasure of making an app. So we didn't have a generalized anxiety disorder program. And I said, hey, this is one of the most diagnosed anxiety disorders, and we don't have a program in our portfolio for this. So, if we really want to seriously compete, then we're going to need to plug that gap. And we created a app called Regain with special permissions from Dr. Dugas, who created the protocol for CBT or one of the main protocols for CBT for GAD.
I think you may win the award for the biggest name drop we've had on this show, Sven.
Yeah, brilliant. And so I managed to get through to him via a friend of a friend. So it was a case of who you know in this instance. And he was really willing for us to use his protocol without any royalties within this app. So intolerance to uncertainty, all that we know from Dugas, that was the core of this program. And yeah, that was a really exciting moment for me in my career, because I was able to use my clinical knowledge to assist in creating the storyboard for the different modules in this. It was given over to developers and designers to actually, code it. I'm not a coder. I don't have that training. But creating the content was one of my most exciting parts of my career so far. Yeah.
I suppose what I'm hearing there is also another combination of the skills you've used before in terms of that in-depth clinical knowledge twinned with this helicopter view of what does this locality or what does the world, and in the case of an app, I guess, need at this point to be able to benefit from what we have here. Considering the experience you'd had prior to this and prior to IESO, I suppose, was typically all NHS based in the context of therapy, IAP talking therapies. How much of a shock was it to kind of segue out of that world and into these more private corporations? What was different about them? What, in reflection, was a bit of a struggle about that?
I think the main struggle was that I was incredibly naive. So I'd come from this world of IAPT, where I'd been spending the last few years in this space where CBT holds the strongest evidence base and is highly effective, and this is what we're going to, offer predominantly in IAP services to begin with. And I think I just started with this naivety that because it's evidence-based, it should sell. And as long as the technology is based on CBT and it's based on the evidence-based protocols, people will be interested in it. I soon discovered that there were, many different barriers, the list is long. But some of those barriers are reputation. So if it's not known, if the name isn't known, then the NHS is still quite sort of, perhaps rightly so, risk adverse. So it sticks with what it knows and what it knows others use. So once you've got your foot in through the front door, it's much easier to maintain. But if you haven't got your foot in through the front door, i.e. having the NHS as a main customer of yours, then it's actually really quite tricky to do that. The structures that are in place for commissioning of new technologies, of tendering, when a tender is up, so when a service says, "Hey, we want to buy in a particular technology," the tender process is all really complicated and very time consuming and slow. And for startup companies, that's really problematic because they don't have that time. Startups can very quickly go under, and I think that especially during the time of Corona, that happened an awful lot. A lot of companies that didn't survive COVID, I guess. I guess it was just that naivety, Ravi, that thinking that this will be easy, and it definitely isn't.
Give us a sense as well of some of the other technology names that followed.
Yeah, following on from that, I actually continued to do some consultancy work for IESO on different projects, which was really nice. And I think it was around this time that I actually went back into being self-employed, and I was running my private practice. That enabled me to do projects. And one of the projects I worked on for IESO was helping them set up a video platform. So they've been working up until that point as live messaging. Many of the NHS customers were saying, we'd like to offer patients the choice. So we had this project of testing, delivery of video sessions, but in true IESO form, not just a video session. They were experimenting with it, creating a transcript. So we would sort of follow both audio streams separately, the audio stream of the patient, the audio stream of the therapist. And in the very early days, it would transcribe that, and you would be able to scroll through that transcript, click on a particular word that the therapist or the patient had said, and it would take you to that part in the video, which for me as a supervisor was amazing, because if I was, sort of reviewing a therapist's work or doing a CTSR, for example, it enabled me to dart around a session really quickly. So I have no idea if they use this technology still, or if they even use it in the same way that they do with their live messaging, which is to power artificial intelligence to make all sorts of assessments of the session. But that's the way that it was going. And I found that super, super interesting. So once you transcribe word for word what's being said in therapy, what that data can actually be used for is really interesting. And from there, I ended up working for Limbic. So Limbic at that point had two core products. One was a sort of triage referral gateway technology. So a chatbot that could be plugged into, say, an NHS Trust's website, and a way of getting a self-referral to the service that engaged the patient in a conversation, did a triage assessment in an engaging way, and also gave the service as much information for them to be able to start to triage. So to be more efficient. And they also at the time had a product that was a therapy assist tool, very much about sort of coaching and supporting the patient in between therapy sessions and giving insights back to the therapist around homework and what the patient had been doing and how their mood had been between the sessions. So really starting to harness the time between therapy sessions as much as possible. And I follow Limbic very closely. I see they're making fantastic headway with their tools, and that their adoption in the NHS has been really successful, and that they've iterated on that product and it gets used a lot now.
Two things that have really struck me from what you said today. So the first thing is that it sounds to me as though, particularly within mental health, we're quite innovative in terms of embracing technology, whereas actually the NHS as a whole is often known for being a little bit behind the times and a little bit slow to respond. But my experience of talking therapies, so we've been approached by Limbic, and obviously I work for IESO. So the digital platforms that are there for therapy, and they've been around a long time. We're not really, we're kind of ahead of the game, right, in mental health. I suppose that's the message that I've got in relation to perhaps physical health within the NHS. But with that in mind, do you think that there is a little bit of growing anxiety amongst therapists around the prevalence of things like AI in terms of work like triage, initial assessment, directing people perhaps onto the correct pathways? Are we maybe moving towards putting people out of jobs? I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, I can only really speak of my personal thoughts and feelings about it, because I don't really have any sort of evidence either way that, artificial intelligence is doing that or not doing that. I personally am not scared about it. I'm not worried about it. I think that demand still vastly outweighs provision to a problematic scale, and it's only getting worse. So if we look at some of the core researchers, in the UK, in the US, in the Netherlands, that talk about prevalence of mental health and accessibility of evidence-based therapies across the globe, there's still a massive mismatch. And I think for that reason, I still see that at this stage, technology has a supportive role. We're still not anywhere near as efficient as we could be in terms of matching people, personality, problem with the right type of therapy at the right time, etc. And we know that CBT is effective, but we also know that it still doesn't work for a lot of people and doesn't work all of the time. So there's a big gap to bridge still, and I can only see that technology has an assistive role in that. It just excites me, really, to think that technology could help me be a better therapist, that it could help me help somebody achieve their goals or a state of recovery, however we might define that in the different contexts, with less time. Because I always know that there's another person that's going to be filling that slot afterwards, and I guess I haven't been exposed to that threat as yet, that my job is at risk. But that says he who is diversifying his career. And, I suppose if I look into the future, where I'd really like to be is I'd like to be what's known as a product manager. And a product manager is somebody who's ultimately responsible for kind of being, they describe it sometimes as the CEO of the product. So they're the one that kind of, they don't do the programming, they don't do the design, but they're managing all the different parts, the moving parts, to take this product forward, to help it get traction, to help it be successful. And until now, I've relied very heavily upon my knowledge and skills and experience as a clinician. But now I'm at that stage where I'm noticing that the technical knowledge is needed, because things like AI, they are very specific areas of technology. So I'm currently studying on the side technical product management. And that's just to have enough knowledge and vocabulary to be able to have conversations with the likes of engineers and not completely zone out because I have no idea what they're talking about. So that's where I'm at. And that's why my career at the moment on paper looks, from a technology point of view, like it's stalled. But that's a very conscious decision. I am focusing on therapy. I'm loving it, I have to say. I'm absolutely loving being a therapist and being a supervisor. It's still at the core of what I do and what I enjoy. But ultimately, I find that the therapy landscape is very exciting, and I am working on one or two projects on the side. One I can say is about supporting supervision and making supervision more accessible, but I'll say no more than that. And the other is to do with homework and using the time between therapy sessions. So yeah, exciting stuff.
Exciting. Yeah, very much.
You spoke there about potentially using technology tools to achieve that kind of personality match between clients and therapists. Is there a danger here that we run down the road of, I suppose, Tinderification of therapy? Therapists kind of making profiles that are designed to sound like the best thing since sliced bread, and ultimately perhaps endangering the client experience?
I think there is a definite risk that choice, or that choice actually is the illusion of choice. What I'm seeing, which I find personally quite frightening at the moment, particularly through social media platforms, is heavily advertised platforms popping up left, right, and center that give this illusion of something that is bespoke, tailored. So they do this very good job of front-loading questions around, have you this? Do you agree with that? How much do you agree with that? That seem to give the impression that they're designing a very bespoke treatment plan at the end. And then if you look at the reviews of the people who've gone through that, what you'll find is that actually what they're either doing is giving people access to a horrific amount of different tools that they're then left to their own devices to try and muddle through, or they're given something that without human involvement and without clinical expertise has been matched to them, but potentially could be poorly matched or a mismatch. And I think that that's where technology providers have a responsibility to be checking that what they're delivering is clinically safe and that it's evidenced. And I think we live in a day and age now where you can ask ChatGPT to write a program for you and make an app, and we're at a point where we're at real risk of throwing out tools that could do more harm than they could do good. And yeah, that's something that concerns me a little bit.
I can imagine it's also quite an ethical fork in the road as well, in terms of, I suppose, usually the way we would act in psychotherapy is to consider the impact of our actions and tread quite carefully around particular things. Whereas I think from what I hear in the industry, the modus operandi within particularly AI at the moment, and to coin a previous catchphrase from a technology company, is basically move fast and break things, right? Just get to the innovation really quickly. I'm wondering how truly compatible those two ideologies are, and I suppose I'm wondering how one resolves those conflicts.
Yeah, well, if we think about what break things would be in this instance, we're talking about people, and people with potentially very difficult problems like post-traumatic stress disorder, histories of abuse, etc. So I think we have to remind ourselves, when we're not talking about breaking technology here, we're talking about breaking people. And I think it's important that where technology is used in clinical settings, whether it's mental health or physical health, that we have a bar that we can at least show that it at least does no harm, and that ideally it's as good as or better than the usual standard of care. Otherwise, what is the point?
Bringing this back into your personal profile, when we think about the journey you've been on with these tech companies, it's clear that in terms of like sort of storyboarding app flows and things like that have clearly used your CBT training to influence that process. And I'm just wondering how else CBT training assisted you in industries outside of just giving therapy or supervision.
Yeah, it's a really good question, actually. So I'm just I'm smiling because I remember as a manager having to have management supervision meetings, and it coming quite naturally to me to set a collaborative agenda, for example. And I remember, supervisees of management supervision to me saying, "Oh, I've never had management supervision like this before. I usually get told what the agenda is and what we've got to discuss." So I think that collaboration that is at the heart of CBT, and other therapies, I'm sure, as well, has been really, really helpful in other settings, for sure. And the structure, just the structured nature, but collaboration for me is like a big one. I think that's, let's do this together. If we can do that, then that's always better than being done to or done by. So, yeah, that's what springs to mind.
Yeah, and also thinking of the symbiotic relationship between these two elements of your career as well. In a similar vein to a question I asked earlier, how has this experience within the technology industry and in a more corporate environment changed the way you think and act as a therapist? It's
given me insight. So I do provide therapy in a range of settings, and one of those settings is working with employees. So through an employee assistance program. And it's given me insights into some of the struggles that people have when they are very career orientated, when their career, they may be at the young developmental stages of their career, and that means a lot to them. And I think being able to share those insights of different experiences and where things have been difficult and where I've succeeded, but also importantly, where I think I failed, because everything hasn't been plain sailing, and there have been decisions made that I deeply regret and wish I'd have done differently, So I was offered a marvelous opportunity in one of the companies that I've mentioned today years ago, and I ummed and ahed for a little bit too long, and then it was collectively decided that because I was umming and ahhing so long, it was probably an indication that it wasn't quite right for me. But that's something I regret. And that was my more risk-adverse side of me coming out there. So I think it's just helped me to gain a bit more perspective. The downside of that is I've moved about a little bit too much in those years. And I find that it is nice to see something through. If I think about IESO as one of those examples, so when I joined IESO, it was a small company. We were delivering our supervision sessions to the therapists as supervisors in an old converted barn building upstairs in a little village on the outskirts of Cambridge. And when I think about where they are now in the science park, in these big offices, and that they are now working with, US companies, and they are using cutting edge technology and leading in application in artificial intelligence, I kind of think, why didn't I just stick around? So sometimes that curiosity and that desire to experience the new, I think the downside to that is that maybe I could have stuck around a little bit longer in some of those places. So that's something I'm definitely recognizing. And that's why I'm taking my time at the moment to find the next right opportunity, because I'm conscious that I want it to be the right opportunity, something that I can stick with for some time, to also see the benefits of that.
So just imagining the thought of a trainee who's possibly coming to the end of their course and thinking about the road ahead, or even perhaps some more experienced therapists who might be listening, who might be wanting to find a way out of the talking therapies landscape at the moment. Not that we're advocating for that, or just looking for alternative things to engage in alongside potentially a part-time career in NHS talking therapies. How does one look for these opportunities? Is it just a case of being headhunted? Are there any particular avenues that are more promising than others?
I'm trying to think back to how I did it and whether I actually actively searched for these things or whether they came to me. I think it was a mix of both. I think for opportunities to find you, you have to be open to them and to be in the right place at the right time, saying the right things, which means showing that you're open to new opportunities and trying new things, etc. I think if somebody's really considering that they want to diversify their career and they're using their CBT training as a springboard for that, then I'd be starting to look at, maybe short courses or smaller experiences that I can be gaining in order to diversify my portfolio, whether it's a research project that I can be involved in, or whether it's even assisting a company in some of the research that they're doing. So, for example, Limbic has recently been approaching therapists to help them test some of their new technology that they're building. That can act as a springboard, so if you assist and then show interest and then say, hey, actually, I've done a short course in, the application of AI in healthcare, it can lead to all sorts of things. So I think it's about thinking a little bit about where you'd like your career to go and what small steps you can do to take yourself in that direction, whether it's extracurricular or formal training or opportunities that you can get involved with. There's a lot going on in the UK mental health landscape. I still think the UK is a real pioneer for the mental health world, and particularly that bridge between evidence-based mental health care, improving access, technology application within that. I really think that the UK has done a tremendous thing, and I wish more countries would follow suit in terms of, for example, creating things like psychological wellbeing practitioners. I know they're called something different now, so apologies if I'm using old terminology. But it is innovation. I think we forget that sometimes when we're facing the cold face of the daily waiting lists and demand for services and the pressures within the NHS, but it is innovative.
Yeah, I suppose it's once again the difference between being in the middle of the forest and being able to have that lovely helicopter view and seeing where you are in the grand scheme of things. You spoke about innovation there. I mean, right now we are at a potentially quite transformative point in the journey of the NHS. There was the 10-year plan that was released last week now, which placed quite a heavy emphasis on digitisation. And so I can imagine that this is going to be an area that is going to grow in some way. Knowing what you know now and having been outside the NHS talking therapies landscape in some of the roles that you've done, I'm wondering how this has changed your reflections on the way that the NHS or talking therapies operates.
Has it changed my perspective? No, but I can tell you what I don't like to see. So I agree that, the NHS is emphasising, or the policymakers are emphasising the role of technology application to help with the imbalance between demand and supply. What I really don't like to see, and I don't want to see in the future, is non-clinically led innovation. I think that there have been occasions where I've seen technology that's sprung up that has lacked clinical leadership and involvement. And I think there is a real difference in terms of the adoption and the ethical side of the application, when it's not always the case, but when it's clinically led, I feel that it makes a big difference. So I just hope that the superb clinicians, the knowledgeable, experienced clinicians out there don't get sidelined in the process, and that, again, that collaboration is there. It's done with and not to the people that are holding these services together and doing the tremendous work that they do day in, day out, if that makes sense. One area of innovation that I'm really surprised not to see, and that I have seen in other countries, is the use of group therapy as an evidence-based tool. I kind of find that a little bit hard to square up, because that was an innovation that we tried in our service 10 years ago now, where we were delivering group therapy. It was at step 2 and 3, actually. I recall we were doing it at step 3 as well. But surely technology has a role there. So I know that in my other country that I have connections to, Germany, they released a platform called Peers. And it is CBT in group format. So it is clinician-led CBT done in group therapy format online per video. So I'm just thinking, wow, look at the, application there, potentially. We're not talking one person in treatment, we're talking potentially 10 people at a time there.
Yeah, I agree. I think we really could be investing more in our therapy groups, couldn't we? And I know that with the introduction of non-CBT modality offerings within talking therapies as well, that is something that we can explore in a different way. I run the mindfulness group that's only delivered in a group. And we can deliver that digitally beautifully. It doesn't. We don't all need to be in the same venue for that. So that's a really great case in point. I think the other thing I was going to add, Sven, to your point about where we're going next, I'm also really excited about some of the developments that we could be making from a digital perspective. I think selling this can be challenging when we are working within an industry at the moment where every single penny is kind of accounted for, rightly so. Our financial landscape is a tricky one to navigate right now, and I do feel that we're kind of having to think very carefully about where we're directing funds, and if we're investing in AI, digital technologies, at the detriment of upskilling and providing CPD opportunities for existing clinicians, I think that's a real risk. And that's been something that we've been, harping on about in talking therapies for a really long time, the lack of opportunity for just basic CPD, because funding for that is so difficult. And the onus being on therapists to continually financially support their career developments, and to see them money being diverted into new technologies. I do feel that is very hard to sell at the moment.
I think you're right,
Delivering those
Michelle, and I don't
messages
think
in
there's
meetings is hard.
I don't think there's any way around it, is there? The reality is we know that therapists need CPD. It's part of their accreditation requirements. It's not an optional, luxury. And we also know that it has a really positive effect on therapist skill and maintenance of skill longer term. And so I would simply say that the technology providers that are selling to the NHS have a duty to evidence the cost benefit of their application, and if they can't do that, then I think the onus is on the purchasers in this instance to say, well, actually, we have a cost benefit evidence for provision of CPD to our therapists and the ultimate impact that has on our patients, but we don't have a cost benefit of this application. So I think that should be an influencing force in decision making for the purchasers in this instance. But whether that is the reality of what actually happens, I guess, is another matter.
With the experience you have of working in these technological settings and with a pair of eyes that has been able to see the NHS talking therapies landscape from the outside, in your opinion, what does the future hold? Where are we going?
I can't say where we're going. I doubt any of us can, because we don't have crystal balls available to us, right? But I can say maybe a little bit about where I hope we're going. And I think where I hope that we're going is that technology will help us deliver more efficient services that are safer, that increase access, that help people stay well. I think this is a hugely neglected side of therapy that we, or technology application that we haven't really scratched the surface of yet, is what about when patients finish their therapy and they're in that time and space where they need to maintain their skills? How many of those patients actually go on and maintain that? I think David Clark would probably be saying, well, we should all be doing follow-ups. But the reality is, and the commissioning structures of the services is, that follow-ups don't really take place. But maybe there's a role in technology there. I think that also in detecting people who maybe are not going to benefit from short-term therapy. I think we all know from experience that we see now, unfortunately, a lot of people coming through primary care services that have maybe been there for the third or the fourth time, that have chronic, enduring, long-standing treatment refractory difficulties. And I'm thinking, square peg, round hole. It's not fair on the people delivering the services, and it's not fair on the people receiving the services. So we need to reevaluate, what are we doing for those people, and can technology play a role there?
Continuing, I think, with a thread that has shone quite clear throughout our time together today, in terms of using technology to be a great assistant and to augment the offering for the improvement of the patient experience more than anything else. And just to round off today, Sven, I'd like to ask you for 3 different pieces of advice, if I may. First of all, piece of advice to trainees, be it trainees who are in the middle of their training journey, trainees who are coming to the end of their training journey. What would you tell them in order for them to make the most of the landscape and the journey that lies ahead of them?
Allow yourself time. So if I could talk back to my trainee self, I would be telling myself to allow myself the time that it takes to get the number of clinical hours under your belt, the number of supervised hours, the number of successful therapy sessions versus therapy sessions that haven't gone as planned. And it takes time. I think I was quite impatient as a newly qualified of wanting to feel. I think I read somewhere that for someone to reach expert sort of status in a clinical field, we're talking about something like 10,000 clinical hours. So, you're talking a lot of repetition for it to feel automated and like you can do it with your eyes closed, which I wouldn't even now, 10 years later, say is the case.
It may feel to any trainees out there like you have done your 10,000 hours by the end of your training year.
Yes, I'm sure.
But just a refresher that sadly you haven't. And also, I think the beauty of this field sometimes is the fact that it is continually evolving and that you continue to ask yourself questions. And that I suppose it's, with perhaps a more positive spin on this, it's almost like painting the fourth bridge, right? You have the opportunity once you've reached the end to actually go back to the beginning and see what you want to do differently and see if you want to do a new design this time. Second piece of advice, we've spoken today a lot about innovation. And it's become clear throughout this conversation today that when you hear the word innovation, Sven, this doesn't just mean around technology. This actually means in a variety of different ways that, again, seek to improve the client experience. And so I'm wondering where there are trainees or more experienced therapists who can feel quite fearful of innovating. They might feel as though they're hamstrung by policies, governance, budget, perhaps management systems that feel as though they don't really feel conducive to the idea of innovation. What advice would you give them?
The whole time you were asking the question, there was one word that just kept popping into my head, and it was the word flexibility. And I think one of the things that we're harnessing in the IAP program, in CBT, in the delivery context that we're delivering it in, is flexibility. We wouldn't be where we are now if someone hadn't decided to be a bit flexible and experiment a little bit. So this idea of CBT being delivered by non-psychologists, this idea of CBT orientated therapy being delivered by non-therapists, by newly trained well-being coaches. Other countries still balk at this idea because they are stuck in the dark ages of thinking that it's only possible for someone who's spent over 6 years doing their clinical psychology and then psychotherapy training afterwards, etc., can do, this therapy well. So be flexible, because we wouldn't be where we are now in the UK and what we're doing and the many more patients that we're seeing than we did years ago if we weren't prepared to be flexible.
What if they feel the system doesn't allow them that flexibility?
I would challenge them to say that I think it does. I think as long as you can ensure that what you're doing is safe. So it reminds me of when I was a young, newly qualified social worker, and I was working in a team that said you cannot email your patients. You cannot send them attachments with workbooks of self-help materials. And I was that annoying, young, new qualified social worker that said, why? What is the real danger here? Oh, well, they might email you back. Well, yeah, I hope so. Oh, but they might tell you that they're having suicidal thoughts in an email. Okay. Well, let's think that through. How would we respond to that? So I think that as long as safety is at the core of what you're doing, then innovation is always possible. As long as you've thought through how can patient safety be safeguarded, then innovation is usually possible. And most managers will support it.
That sounds deliciously rebellious. Thank you for that, Sven. And
I'll show my rebellious side now.
And the final piece of advice to people who want to spread their wings outside the NHS talking therapies landscape, perhaps with technology, perhaps with other innovations.
If you're a good therapist, don't do it. We need you. Only joking, but we do. We still need good therapists, and everybody's doing a tremendous job. But if you really do want to work in different fields, then my advice would be to just look for the different opportunities that are out there. So do a bit of research, search different terms, Whether it's in the field of research assistant, whether it's in the field of technology, start to look at what the companies are asking for in way of experience, and start to think about how you can start to collect some of that experience, whether that's through projects that you can do or training that you can do. You have to start somewhere, and having those conversations or asking, for that information, I suppose, in the first place is the first place to go.
Definitely. And I think a message that came across quite a lot in the episode that we did on launching private practice as well. If you do decide to spread your wings outside the NHS talking therapies landscape, it doesn't need to be the be all and end all. It doesn't need to be your 9 to 5. You can mix and match. You can do part-time stuff, and you can adopt the graded exposure method of switching to a different industry or a different way of working. Thank you so much for your time today, Sven. Where can people find out more about you or your work, or any other resources that you might have available?
Yeah, so I'm on LinkedIn under my full name, Sven Law. So I suppose people can find me there. People can message me. That's absolutely fine. And I would say that's probably the easiest place to find me. Alternatively, my private practice email address, which is ithinkifeelido@gmail.com. So keeping CBT at the heart of it. ithinkifeelido@gmail.com.
And the first time I heard that email address, I thought it was absolutely genius. Thank you.
It wasn't taken.
That's a great point, actually. Clearly, there aren't enough CBT stalwarts out there. Thank you for your time today, Sven. And we hope to have you back on again soon.
Thanks you, Sven.
Ravi. Thanks, Michelle. Take care.
So, Shell, what did you make of that then?
Wow, Ravi, honestly, that was an amazing conversation. It was very engaging to listen to. So Sven has just shared with us so beautifully his really exciting and ever-changing career pathway. And I find it very inspirational. As somebody who's also wanted to explore diversifying and, enhancing my role, I thought it was very, very interesting hearing about how courageous you might need to be at the beginning to put yourself out there, take some steps to, approach people, get involved in things that you might not have been involved in before. But the payoff could be very rewarding. And just hearing about all of the different things that Sven has done in his career, I found that very inspirational. Yeah.
I think inspirational is a brilliant word for it. And I think, there were a whole host of takeaways from that interview. I think what really shines through for me, there's a tendency amongst people sometimes to think that I trained as a high-intensity CBT therapist, ergo I am now a train on a tracks, and all I will ever be is a high-intensity CBT therapist or a service manager or a supervisor. And I think it was really refreshing to firstly broaden those horizons, but also serve as a key reminder that as part of that training, you are being given a toolbox. You are being given this toolbox full of tools, and it's up to you how you want to use those. If you just want to use those purely in an NHS talking therapies context, that's perfectly fine, and that's not a bad thing. We need therapists right now. Particularly as someone who works in a talking therapy service and has seen the waiting list that we have at the moment, we need therapists. However, if you feel as though it's a bit of the same day in, day out, if you feel as though you want a bit of a change, you can perfectly take those tools and use them in any setting or industry of your choice to forge the trail that you would like to trail. We've said so often on this show that in a strange way that the end of the training is really just the beginning. I think it's important to stress that it's not just the beginning of your career as a high intensity CBT therapist. It's the beginning of the rest of your life, and it's up to you how you want to use the skills that are imbued within you. And there's no limits if you don't want them to be there. In terms of our show today, we want to, as usual, thank you for listening. Just a reminder as well, we said this at the top of the show, please join the Two Lost Souls mailing list. We're trying to build a little community. We definitely do not spam you, but what we do is we send you details of upcoming episodes before anyone else. We invite you to contribute to upcoming shows as well, and we can experiment in the future in terms of how much further we can take that collaborative nature of the mailing list as well. Alternatively, if you want to get through to us, email us at hello@twolostsouls.co.uk. We do still have a Twitter. It doesn't get checked maybe as often as it used to, but please feel free to reach out to us at TLS_pod if you would like. We have some fantastic episodes coming up on long-term conditions, on burnout, and on children and young people's IAPT as well. So stay tuned for those, and we look forward to seeing you again soon for another episode of Two Lost Souls.